Okay, welcome everyone to this episode of the Consciousness and Context Circle for the Source of Synergy. And I'm Alan Steinfeld, along with Desiree Hertak and JJ Hertak, who are leading this group, and our founder, our chief, Diane Williams, is going to speak about this, and then I'll introduce our guest today. So go ahead, Diane.
Okay, well, this is the Contact and Conscious Evolution Synergy Circle. Alan always says consciousness, but close. Of the evolutionary leaders of the Source of Synergy Foundation. And our purpose is to support and accelerate the conscious evolution of humanity and expansion of human awareness through increasing our individual and collective readiness for ongoing contact with other intelligences in our cosmic family, including contact with those in non-physical fields of consciousness. So I think you're all on the mailing list. Janice, are you on the mailing list? Oh, you're on mute.
I am now.
Okay, great, because I was going to say if anybody's not on it.
He added me recently.
Good, okay.
Yeah.
So, and I think everybody else is. And just to inform everybody, as you know, these meetings are recorded. And is there anything else we need to say? No. So anyway, we're really delighted to have Richard Lang with us, and Alan's going to be introducing him.
Yes,
so thank you for coming
with us today, because this circle is about really going public with this knowledge. There's another aspect of the circle that's private, where people discuss experience, but someone brings someone like Richard to the group, gives us this bigger, broader perspective on what's going on. So I'll just introduce, I'll spotlight Richard, and then I'll do a little introduction about who Richard is. And I was really happy to make his acquaintance when I met him in Sedona. But Richard was a key member of MUFON, which is the Mutual UFO Network, the longest running established UFO organization in the world. He is a trained certified field investigator. Maybe he'll talk about that a little bit, what it means to be a field investigator. Chief Case Investigator for the states of Virginia and North Carolina. He was also one of the original 6 members of the MUFON STAR team. Maybe he'll talk about that too. But I think the real key here is that he worked for BAASS, the Bigelow Aerospace funded administration that worked with the government. It was funded by the Defense Intelligence Agency. So he's going to give us some insight into what it's like to work with those organizations, what they know, what they don't know. He was also involved with the investigation at Skinwalker Ranch. He's the author of 2 books, UFO Investigations, Methodology for a New Age, and UFO Investigations, The Age of Disclosure, Disclassification, and What the Government Knows About UFOs. And that's really why you're here, Richard, to tell us what the government knows about UFOs. So you want to start with background about MUFON and how, and why do you get involved in this crazy, Meshuggah subject to begin with?
Well, a lot of people ask me, I've been doing this for more than 30 years, and people say, well, what got you interested? What you got started? Well, I'm a pilot, commercial rated pilot, and I've got a degree in aeronautics that I got from Embry-Riddle University in Florida. When I was a flight student, one night I was flying up the coast by myself in about 2,500 feet in a high performance airplane. And I heard these airline captains talking about a UFO. And basically, I've outlined the whole thing in my book, but essentially what happened is when you're traveling like that, you've got one of your radios tuned to where you just came from, and then the other radio's tuned to the approach control at the next place you're heading. That's how it works. So I'm listening. You're always listening to radio traffic just to know what's going on. And I hear this Eastern Airline captain call in, and he tells the air traffic controller that he's got traffic in his flight path. What that means is there's something in his flight path. And the controller comes back and says, negative radar contact, which means he's saying that they don't see anything on the radar. A couple of minutes later, the guy calls in again and goes, look, we've got traffic in our flight path. We've got a visual on it. There's 2 of us, and it's huge. It's unconventional. It's rotating over the ocean, and it's got multicolored lights on it. And the controller comes back, oh, negative radar contact. Well, then another guy in a jet, a business jet, he calls in and he said, we're 20 miles west of Eastern and we've got a visual on the same object. And so at that point, my ears are perked up. I couldn't see it because it was too far out over the ocean, because I was flying up the coast. But, obviously I'm like all trying to figure out what's going on. And the controllers keep saying there's nothing there. Well, then I was flying to Jacksonville, which at that time was I think it still is a naval air station and civilian airport, both. I was going to land, get gas, and go back to Daytona. So when I got up to Jacksonville, I asked them to clear me to land, and they wouldn't do it. They said, maintain holding for departing military traffic. So I'm sitting there flying around in a circle, and the next thing you know, you see these two fighter jets come screaming off the runway, go out over the ocean, full afterburners. They blow right through the sound barrier, and they head right out to where those pilots said that thing was. So I'm sitting there thinking, okay, well, I learned a couple things. One, there was something out there because two pilots reported it from different perspective angles in jets. The air traffic controllers were basically denying that anything was going on, but then they confirmed it because they dispatched fighter jets out to intercept it. So that's how I got started about 35 years ago.
Wow. And then you got into MUFON. Talk about what.
Right. So I had been interested always when I joined MUFON, and I was certified field investigator. I ended up working. I ended up being the chief investigator for Virginia and North Carolina. For a while, I was the state director in North Carolina too. And I was one of the first. There were 6 of us on the STAR team, and I was the first person that actually managed the MUFON STAR team. And so we kind of created it back then. Well, what happened was when the Defense Intelligence Agency was working the deal out with Bigelow, basically there was money that was allocated based on lobbying from Robert Bigelow and Harry Reid, and they had some serious money allocated to study some of these things. And so what they did is they created BAASS, which, to be clear, I always mix this up. BAASS stands for Bigelow Aerospace Advanced Space Studies. And it was created as a sister company for Bigelow Aerospace. And it was specifically designed to be the receptor for that money that was being allocated by the DIA to do this study.
What year did you say that was? That study, the BAASS study was what year?
What it was is it was designed.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, I didn't understand the question. You said what year?
Year was that? What year did that study begin?
Well, it was like it was the end of 07, 08, 2008. Okay. Yeah. So essentially what happened was I was part of the original project team to basically put this deal together between Bigelow, BAASS, and MUFON. And the way it worked was this. Is they had made a contractual arrangement. We had a contract. MUFON had a contract with BAASS. And basically the contract said, we're buying information from you. And so what we did is we created a team of people. At that time, there were 12 of them, and they were called dispatchers. And what they would do is somebody would be on duty 24/7, and all the cases that would come into the MUFON CMS, client management system, whatever you want to call it, the CMS system, if somebody would file a report, one of those dispatchers who's ever on duty, they would look at the report, they would verify the contact information, and sometimes they even call the witness just to clarify things. And then, we're getting like 800 reports a month coming in. And so out of 800 reports, they'd end up they picked maybe 40 or 50 of them that were really good ones. It's kind of like, a UFO report is grandma's 87 and she's out walking her dog at 2:00 in the morning and she saw a light in the sky. That's a UFO report. And then you've got an airline flight crew that has a close encounter at 35,000 feet with something that's twice as big as their airplane. That's a UFO report. Now, which one do you want to talk to? So that was the whole idea, is you'd weed through all the stuff and really try to identify the really good, high quality reports. So I'd get 35 to 50 of them every month.
Just want to clarify something. So Robert Bigelow is a millionaire, really devoted to the topic of UFO investigation. I think he's probably seen things. He was interviewed on 60 Minutes, and they said, "Why are you involved with this UFO thing? Don't you think they really exist?" He goes, "I know they exist. I know there's ETs here." So that's for the record on 60 Minutes, but also
I saw it.
yeah. BAASS was then commissioned by the government. Harry Reid, Robert Bigelow, Harry Reid, this whole Nevada kind of thing. Harry was the senator from Nevada, gave money to BAASS, and then BAASS,
No. Harry Reid was part of the lobbying, and Robert Bigelow was part of the lobbying. But basically, the Defense Intelligence Agency put the money up for this. The money was funneled through Bigelow Aerospace, and it went into BAASS. And so the money came from the DIA to BAASS, and then BAASS paid MUFON and everybody involved. And at the time, I knew that it wasn't Robert Bigelow's money personally, but I didn't know where it was coming from. I figured it was one of the agencies, but nobody could tell you that.
Just want to say the upshot of that was eventually in 2017, the New York Times came forward and said, guess what? There was this money. And so the whole UFO story broke December 16th, 2017, which was going back to 2007, the program Richard was working on. So did you have a question?
Yeah.
Well, it's not really fair to say the story broke, because basically the BAASS project was very well advertised. What wasn't advertised was the fact that the Defense Intelligence Agency was funding it. And then the article in 2017, like Leslie Keene and those guys wrote, was basically telling the rest of the story, that the Defense Intelligence Agency was behind the whole thing. So that's kind of how that worked out. We knew the money was there, but we didn't know where it was coming from. And going back to that for a second, it was really an awesome program. I mean, basically everybody worked there got paid. I got paid a very nice salary to run it. We had an operations person that handled all the financial stuff and all the transportation arrangements and all that kind of thing. So if I'd get 35 to 50 reports a month, I might deploy, 9 or 10 people to go out and actually investigate a case or meet with people. And what we had done is we wanted to run it like a business. So when we set it up, we put out, basically advertised that we're hiring investigators. And we ended up getting about 50 people that applied and qualified as investigators, and they were spread out all over the country by deliberate intention. So, because you don't want to deploy somebody from, San Francisco to go work on a case in Virginia. So we had people scattered all over the place. So when I'd get a case, I would deploy a person close to that area and send them out to work on the case. And so they'd go and interview the people, collect the data, get the photographs, any video, anything that we could get. And they'd put all that together and send it back to me, and I would consolidate it into a very specific format. And then that would be passed on to BAASS. And then every Friday we'd have a conference call, and I would talk to the guys at BAASS about the reports and all that kind of thing. Well, as of recently, when the book came out about the Skinwalker at the Pentagon, George Knapp and Colum Kelleher were very good to me, because they named me as the person that ran that part of the project and said I did a good job. And they also said that the people at the Pentagon were reading my reports every day, which I didn't know, but I was really grateful to them for sharing that publicly. And I've been on Coast to Coast 3 times in the last year with George, and also I did that Mystery Wire show with him and stuff like that. He's been very good to me. But go ahead.
Go ahead.
So how involved was Bigelow in that project? Like, would you actually talk to him or see him involved at all? Okay. And then also, as Alan said, he was a fascinating person. Did he ever disclose to other people why he got involved in this? Because as he said,
I can't answer that, because I don't know what he thinks about it. But during that project, Colum Kelleher was the head person. There were 4 or 5 other guys that I met with on a regular basis, talked to some of them every day. And some of them they don't want their names advertised. And so I wouldn't do that. But Bigelow never, from my perspective, I never talked to him or ever had any dealings directly with him. I dealt with the crew that was set up. Now, what I can tell you, which helps make it a little clearer, is that there were really two components to this thing. There was the non-classified side, and then there was the classified side. So essentially what I just described to you, we were going through the MUFON reports and we were picking out good cases and we were investigating them, and then we're sending the data to Bigelow, to BAASS. Now, what a lot of people at that time didn't understand is that we had a contract arrangement with those guys. Essentially, we had a contract with them where they were buying information from us, and they were paying us $57,000 a month. It was a really good deal. And you know, all those people that, like the investigators, if they went on a case, they got paid $100 a day. They were all issued Visa cards, so we could, you know, put their hotel, you know, the money for their hotel rooms and their per diem for food and their travel expenses and airline tickets were all paid for. And we even had some like Pelican cases with equipment. So if you were going to a certain airport, when you got off the plane, your Pelican case with all your gear in it would be waiting for you in baggage claim. I mean, we had this down fast so we could roll quick. And by quick, I mean, I got a call one morning at 11 o'clock in the morning. I was in North Carolina, and there was a case in Texas. And by 6 o'clock that night, I was in the guy's backyard. That's about as fast as you can go.
Wow.
And that's what you have to do. The faster you get there, the sooner you get there, the better off you are getting some really good information.
To go for a little background, if people are interested in what that report entailed, the Skinwalkers at the Pentagon book that came out last year. It's a really excellent overview of how the Defense Department and the organization BAASS were involved in investigating the UFO phenomena, particularly at Skinwalker Ranch, but other places as well. And what was the strangest case, Richard, that you came across? And also, were you accessible to the classified? Did you access the classified?
No. Let me explain that. So essentially, what we did on my side, I used to call it being on my side of the mirror, but basically, what we were doing is we were collecting this data, we were investigating it, and forwarding it on to the Bigelow people. Now, the agreement that we had with them specifically said that anything that we were given that information, we were selling that information to them. So they were buying that information. And what that meant to them was that it was proprietary. And that was very clearly disseminated to everybody that was in the orbit that was dealing with it. So bottom line is, if I worked on a case and investigated it and I turned it over to them, they didn't have to tell me. They would go work the case some more and do a lot more research on it, but they were never going to come back and tell me what their results were because it was proprietary. And initially, there was a lot of people at MUFON that were like, they were supposed to do this. Well, no, that's not what they were supposed to do. They did exactly what we contracted for. And once we turned it over, whatever they did with it, that was their deal. It was their information and their case. Now, just to give you an example, like a good case, if you want to talk about, in the book, since you read the book, there's a case in that book about a guy that was basically, he goes outside and there's this huge triangle craft hovering over his property. And the book describes the you know, it's the whole thing is in detail in the book. But essentially what happened, that report came in, and I personally, with another guy, went out and interviewed that guy. So I went out to his house and interviewed him for about 2 hours and it was all video. I videotaped it. And then what I did was, when I got back, I uploaded that video. And you know, by that night, the guys at Bigelow were watching the video that I did about this guy's interview. And essentially what he did is he went outside, he tried to take a couple of pictures with cameras, and every time they'd get out there, the batteries would go dead, which isn't all that unusual. And then the mistake he made was, he had one of those like million candle power spotlights that people use for like spotting deer at night when they're hunting. So he goes and gets that and puts it up on the craft. And as soon as he does that, this very bright white beam of light comes down on him and burns him. It hit him and it's like really hot, like super hot sunburn. He went down on his knees and he kind of cowered down on his back and he got back in the house. But when I went there a couple of days later, his back was blistered. He looked like somebody that fell asleep out in the sun on the beach somewhere all night. And And you know, we took all that was part of the video and the pictures that were and everything recorded. Well, then in the book you can see that the guy, they did a lot of very extensive health doctors, you know, examinations and things like that on him. And the guy developed a lot of, you know, it's all in the book there, but he developed a lot of health problems and stuff like that from it. But it was a good case in the sense that it was a lot of physical evidence, you know, and you know, that's the kind of thing that makes the cases like really, really, really good. There was, I'll give you one more case that we worked on that's been pretty famous, and that was up in Port Jarvis, New York. And we got a report that this guy had had a very close encounter with something that hovered over his car, and it knocked the electrical system out in his car. So I sent a guy up there to talk to him. The guy got there like the next day, and he interviewed this guy, and he went out and looked at the car. It was a brand new Mitsubishi. And the investigator told me when he walked up to the car, he put his hand out, and 6 to 8 inches away from the car, you could feel this incredible static cling on it. It's like when you open up a cleaner bag and you pull a wool sweater out of there. You could feel that from 8 inches away on that car. So with that, we did a lot of analysis on the vehicle. There was a super high, very powerful magnetic field that was on the car. And we even, you know, I mean, there was a lot of work goes into this stuff where the car was brand new. So I had them call a local dealer with the serial number and see if they could find another car that was brand new that might have been made at the same time, which we did. We found a car that was 6 cars back in the assembly line that was made at that same time. And we sent a team out to analyze that car too, just to make sure there wasn't some kind of creepy magnetic anomaly on that car, which there wasn't. But the guy had he had no health consequences. There was no missing time, but there was a really strong field on the car. The most miraculous part about that report was that when the object hovered over his vehicle, everything in the car went out. The headlights went out, the dash lights went out, the cell phone was dead, the radio's dead, and he's like sitting there in the dark. And he said that it sounded like a cat purring. And so once that happened, he started first he was curious, and then he started getting scared. And so he's thinking, you know, what do I do? Do I stay in the car? Do I get out of the car? Do I run? You know? And by the way, the answer is always stay in the car. Do not get out of the car if something like that happens. But he finally was able to get the door open because the door locks were all dead. Everything, everything in the car, the electrical system was dead. And so he finally got the car door open. He still had his seatbelt on. He looks out like that. When he did that, it was gone. And I said, did the lights go out or did it disappear? He goes, I don't know. I just want to get the hell out of there. But what was interesting about this, and this is what, you know, all the rage about this case is so I flew out there to talk to him about it. And basically I said to him, so when everything came back on, the lights came back on, dash lights, the radio's back on, and the car started up. He goes, no. I said, what do you mean? He goes, the car did not start up. It was just running. And I said, help me understand that. He's like, it'd be like if you're watching a movie and you push the pause button, and then when you push the play button. And he goes, that's what it was. The car everything came back on. The car was running. It didn't start up. You know, think about that for a while.
Missing time in there, I would say.
Yeah, well, that's what it's some kind of time dilation that would probably do that. Yeah, that was what we concluded.
That's cute. You said don't get out of the car because Travis also with his one of his friends also saw something again later on, and he goes, what's the one thing?
Well, the reason you don't get out of the car is in my book. I've written about a lot of what you can do, and shouldn't do. And one of the things in there is don't ever point a bright light up at one of those things because nothing good ever happens when you do that. And I'm basing that on 30 years experience and talking to a whole bunch of people. The other thing is that if you get one of these things, it's fairly, and it's close to the ground. The propulsion system, it's a form of electrogravitic, they call it electrogravitic propulsion, but it's basically anti-gravity propulsion. But underneath the bottom of it, there's like a magnetic radiation that's very similar to microwave. So when you get out of the car, it'd be like sticking your head in a microwave oven, and it will do cell damage. And also, if you have one of these things and it's powered up and it's on the ground, the skin of the craft Sometimes people say it has a shimmer look to it, but basically you'll get radiation coming off of that. And it's like in the X-ray spectrum, and it will cause radiation sickness. So, don't go running up to it. Don't touch it. Don't get underneath them. Those are the kind of things where if you do, you're going to have some health consequences. Even with Bigelow, one of the things that I think they mentioned that in the book too, but we always thought that people have been injured in these kinds of things. They've been injured when they get too close to something, but generally speaking, the consensus is it wasn't done by the ETs with deliberate intention. It's just like somebody walked under there and they shouldn't have. It's like somebody has a car accident. Somebody gets out there and like Travis got out and ran underneath it, and that's happened more than once, and usually it's not good.
Well, in the latest bill that was passed for Congress, the National Defense Authorization Act, there's a provision in there for people who've been injured by witnessing UAPs. It's actually in the congressional bill. And so there's a whole budget and support system for people who, and so in a way, they're acknowledging the government right there that was signed by the president that this exists and that people have been injured.
And of course, an earlier report also cited some of these things, but are there other evidences that you saw? Because there seems to be different states, as you mentioned, that maybe people didn't have a negative encounter like that, or
even a positive encounter, healings and all that.
Well, there's a lot to that. In my research, I've interviewed more than 50 abductees. And when I say interviewed, I mean I've had relationships with them where I talked to them for many times and got inside their head and tried to understand what it was all about. I typically have not seen a lot of evidence that would indicate that these guys are hostile. And somebody said, well, they did this really bad test on this lady and she was bleeding and everything. And I said, yeah. And then they took her home and tucked her in bed. They could have dropped her off in the ocean somewhere. So, there's all that kind of thought. The other thing is, one of the things, and I guess we're going to get into this anyway, but in my book, I wrote this book. It's called The Methodology for a New Age. And the reason that, one of the reasons that I wanted to write it is because having been doing this stuff for so many years, guys go out there and they've got their cameras and their magnetometers and all their, electromagnetic instruments and stuff like that. And they're looking for physical evidence. And there's a lot of merit to that. But what I've learned is there's a lot more to it than the physical part. And there's when you look at there's a chapter in my book about higher levels of consciousness. And, essentially, when you talk about like higher levels of consciousness, you get into like the fifth dimension, where you've got consciousness that doesn't need to inhabit a physical body to exist. From everything I've ever learned, the more highly evolved or the higher up you go and how many octaves up you go in the stages of consciousness, those entities are benevolent. It's all about, there's no anger, there's no fear, they're not violent, it's all very loving energy. So a lot of times when people say, well, they're here, they're advanced civilizations, I think the more advanced they are, the less likely they are to be trying to hurt us, and more likely to try to help us evolve and develop. I mean, think about it. If you're up there buzzing around in a flying saucer, all you have to do is, fly over the Ukraine, and you got to like, what in the hell are these people doing? This doesn't, for them, they probably think like we're horribly violent, which we are, by comparison. If that answers your question.
Very good. I want to congratulate you. Great field investigation. Years ago, I worked with George Van Tassel in Southern California, and he believed that there were several spiritual levels beyond the extraterrestrial. Some would call them the extra celestial. In your investigations, would you say there's a preponderance of what I would call higher spiritual categories that have been overlooked or that needs to be investigated in addition to the physical contact stories?
And to add to that, Alan has a book called Making Contact, and in there, I think it's fascinating, similar to what you just said, that oftentimes when you've just seen a UFO, you don't even have to go up in them. you have this mental interconnection from then on. Have you reported on any of that?
Yeah. Let me let me break that down a little bit. Start with what you suggested was one of the things that in my book I talk about, and I got the stuff from Jacques Vallée and Eric Davis, but basically what we had done, or what they had done, is they broke this thing down into what they call different layers or different spheres. And they start out with the physical. The physical part is this, like if you have an encounter or there's a contact, that you can see it with your eyes. It'll show up on radar. It can be photographed. It'll show up in video and all that kind of stuff. And if it lands on the ground, it'll make marks, and you can track it for the velocity and all that kind of thing, and look to see what kind of energy is expelled and all that kind of stuff. Then you get to what they call the anti-physical, and that's more do you guys, am I back? Can you see me okay? I can't see me anymore.
Great, Richard. You're perfect. Yeah.
Okay, cool. The anti-physical stuff is where you've got things that just totally defy our world, our science, the way we know it. And we're talking about things that, like, they reappear and they disappear. They don't show up on radar sometimes. They won't be photographed sometimes. I've worked on a number of cases, more than one, where somebody, like a couple people are here and there's something up there, and we're all looking at it. We can all see it. So I take my video camera and point it at it, and it doesn't come up on the screen. We can see it, but it won't show up on the camera. And that happens more than once. What you were talking about, the one of the things that we talk about is the psychic layer, and there, the only way I can illustrate it is to say, you read a report and somebody says, I was out walking my dog or having a cigarette at 2 o'clock in the morning, and I saw this light that was at great distance and high altitude. And I watched this light, and the more I watch it, the more I get the feeling it somehow can interpret my thoughts or tell that I'm thinking about it. And the next thing you know, it's right over top of me. And so they said it anticipated their thoughts. And so you take that at face value and say, well, boy, that's really, okay. But when you go back and look at the data and go through the research, the reports, there's hundreds of those reports where the people say exactly that same thing, that anticipated my thoughts or reacted to my thoughts. So, if one person says it, if 100 people say it that aren't connected to each other, then you got to say, okay, then it probably, there's something very significant about this. And that's part of the reason why we collect data. So yeah, they do anticipate thoughts. A lot of times people say that.
Right.
Go ahead.
What we had from Close Encounters of the Third Kind, of course, Jacques Vallée was part of that, and Jan Hynek. But the thing is, when Richard Dreyfuss saw the vehicle, similar thing, of course, the car went out and then he got going. But later on, it was still in his head. So even, some months later or whatever the movie was portrayed,
Right.
he didn't build the place he was supposed to go to, but he was getting this kind of message of where to go. And that's what I'm also talking about. It seems, even if he didn't, take a ride in a UFO, because that's what people want to do, but just seeing it seems to make this what we call like non-local awareness and interconnectionness. I had that with, I've written about that in Alan's book, that I had a girlfriend in Florida, because I grew up in that area as well. Lots of, sightings in that area. And so even after she had her encounter, which happened to be on the ocean, she had this contact, and they were almost always watching what she was doing, she felt, and things would happen around her because of that.
Well, yeah, I think that's the whole point, is that they do seem to get to, like, once you've had that kind of contact, it's like your brain's been rewired a little bit. Your consciousness is altered to connect with that and understand it. Consider that, most of the close encounters, people say that when they communicate with them, it's like telepathic. You can hear it in you can hear it without your lips moving. And I guess that's kind of scary, but the concepts, visual concepts come into your mind, and that would account for the differences in languages and stuff too, but that's very common that people have that. And I was talking with George Medich the other day, who runs the ERT, at MUFON, and he was talking about a book which I'm reading right now, and basically these guys wrote a book about there's 100 cases where people were healed and stuff by having, some kind of contact like that. And George, I haven't read the book yet, but he was saying it's just so sad because the technology they use radio waves and light to cure people. And, he said, we're still butchering people's bodies up and stuff like that, and they've got technology. They don't have to do that kind of thing anymore,
You're reading. What's the name of that book, Richard?
Oh, I knew you were going to ask me. Embarrassed me because, wait a minute, I'll have to dig it up.
Preston, Preston Dennett, someone who's tracked.
That's it. That's yeah.
Yeah, healed by the UFO. But going back to collecting all those reports from MUFON, you said 800 a month or something back.
Yeah.
Well, in the latest report from the government, the assessment of the UFO situation, UAP situation, they say they only have 400 cases that they know of about UFOs. So they're obviously.
If you believe that, I've got some swampland I'll sell you in Florida.
Public record. They're in the public saying there's only 400 cases they know of. How do they get away with that, especially when there's proof that there's thousands?
I know from McDonnell Douglas, my colleagues there were thousands of cases that were privately looked at.
There's been, if in the book that I wrote, I did an assessment of that first report that came out. And the only thing good about it was that they were admitting there was something to it. They're still trying to say it's swamp gas or weather balloons, but they're saying they only had 400 reports to work with, which is, that is just complete crap, because there's like thousands of these. What you've got MUFON, and again, I also want to make sure I'm clear. I do not run anything for MUFON. I don't have any official capacity at MUFON. I'm a benefactor. And I have a life membership, which means I get a journal subscription, but that's the extent of my involvement with them. I don't belong to any groups or manage anything or do anything with that. I told you that up front. But, these databases, I don't know. Back then, if we were getting again, I don't have a handle on what's happening today, but I suspect they're probably getting 600 to 800 cases. And then you've got Davenport's the Fund for UFO Research. And they get a bunch of cases, and that's just in North America. Then go over to Europe and Asia. There's thousands of people seeing stuff every year. And with the government and all the military bases and everything that they have, they're getting they've got more than 400 reports. There's guys that I've talked to some of these guys that work in these nuclear facilities when they fly over and shut all the nuclear missiles down and stuff like that. And they know it. I think that
I wanted to
it's
ask
a little game
of your reports about electrogravitics. Did you interface with people from Caltech or other area think tanks that would be able to come to that conclusion?
Sometimes when people share information with me and tell me not to tell them where I got it, I pretty much do that. So that we'll just leave it at that. A lot of times I called it my book breadcrumbs, because like I ask somebody a question and they say, Rich, I can't answer that question because it's classified. But then a week later, somebody sends you an email and say, you really need to read this book, like chapter 12. and there it is in the book. You see what I'm saying? So I call those breadcrumbs, where they can't tell you, but they can point you to some public information that you can figure out what you want to do, if that makes sense. But yeah.
That you can't tell us, JJ?
High-end science that would imply other paradigms of propulsion or
you can go online and start Googling and look up electrogravitics, and you'll find there's a ton of stuff out there about it.
Both electromagnetic and the gravity.
Electrogravitics from our side or their side?
No, our side. Technology that's both. It's anti-gravity propulsion, but some of that stuff has radiation that comes out of it, and that's just what my point in it is, not so much to get into the mechanics of how it works, but that if I'm working on a book right now that's designed for first responders and police, to one and make them aware of the stuff, that how much this stuff is going on, but also to make sure they would know what to do and not to do when, if something happens that they're experiencing, and also to help them understand that, like right now, if somebody's been abducted and the police intercept that person, they're gonna think the person is gone mad, that they're insane. And I at least want police to understand this happens and maybe be a little bit more sympathetic to somebody that might have had an encounter like that, if that makes sense.
MUFON effort that way with Schlusser, I think, in 1990s, right? Do you know that report that was adapted by some of the people like Alessandro? I think his name was Schlusser, for MUFON. It was in
Schussler?
Yeah, that guy. He put out a whole report of what to give to psychiatrists and doctors based.
Yeah, I don't have that. Schussler's given me stuff. He's one of the people that gave me valet's work that you know, that I've used in my books. But the thing is that, you know, some of the research I'm doing now, there was a seminar that was done at MIT back in the 80s about abduction, and there's a manual that was written about it. I don't know if you know what I'm talking. It's like this thick. It's real, like this thick.
Yes,
You have that. And when you read through that, it seems like they were a lot more open and candid about this stuff than they are now. I mean, there's no way in hell you'd be giving a seminar and people be talking like that in public now. You know what I'm saying? But it's like fascinating, some of the things they talk about in that book.
In fact, we've gone back to the 50s and what even the presidents were saying, and astronauts, and
Right.
more advanced almost in the 50s and 60s than they are coming out now. Of course, we're still optimistic that changes take place, but how many, you kind of indicated some of this technology also we've back engineered. How many of the sightings that you received did you feel maybe were even human, but you know, we've been developing that technology, like something coming out of Area?
Well, you know, that's the thing that, of course, the government would like you to think this is all just advanced military technology. And I think I'm getting little messages popping up here. I didn't mean to be distracted. There's a little of, the answer is there's a little of both. There is some, I would say some of the triangle craft that you see could be advanced military technology, but they typically don't test that stuff over like New York City or Manhattan and stuff like that. You see what I'm saying?
Yeah.
What you asked me something and I had a thought and I lost it. What'd you just say about this is what happens when you get old?
What's coming out of Area 51, but also Alan mentioned, of course, I think it was December 2018, that there was that unusual
Terminal shaped object
over the Pentagon. Was that there?
Oh yeah. I would say that most of this stuff that you're seeing, like one of the most fascinating things is the Phoenix Lights, just for example, you know. And then you know, you saw what was going on, and even the governor Simonson, you know, they had somebody come out with an alien suit on and stuff like that. But then later they interview this guy and he's like, we were scared shitless, man. We didn't know what to do. And he admitted that he drove out there and saw that thing. And he said that it had a wingspan of over 2 miles across. And he goes, like, I was in the Air Force, I'm a pilot, and there's no way that thing came from this planet, you know. And then the Air Force comes out later on and they're dropping flares down to try to, you know, and he said at 11 o'clock when the news cameras were all videotaping the lights, they were flares the Air Force dropped for the news cameras to just create a diversion, you know. So you know, that some of this stuff is just unbelievably phenomenal. I'm writing one of the cases I'm writing about in my book now. You know, guys are talking about being the military, being taken out on a beach, and you know, he said this huge thing came down from the sky, and I'm like, define huge for me. He goes, it was bigger than a strip mall shopping center. You know, those are not, you know, earthly type things that happen. And I've interviewed people like some guys that were in a submarine, they surfaced, and this thing comes up out of the water next to him, and he said, you know, it was huge. It was like 10 football fields across, that kind of thing. You know, so there's some both.
I worked in Brazil with General Ochoa, who was head of the UFO program with their Air Force there. And with Dr. Heineck, we had an interview back in the 80s. And Ochoa said some of these craft are larger than aircraft carriers.
Yeah. Well, when you were talking about in the 50s, one of the things that was, I am a publishing business, Lang Publication, and we publish books mostly about UFO stuff. But if you've ever heard of Fran Ridge, I published 2 books for him. He was one of the original NICAP people. And, in the process of publishing his books, I got to talk to him a lot. And back in the 50s and stuff like that, he's talking about like something happens and they go respond to it. And there's a guy from the Air Force there and they're all hanging out together and talking about it, working on it together. It's not like now where, your car would have a bunch of flat tires on it before you got anywhere near the place,
No, I think, what you're pointing to also is that it seems worldwide that there's been
Oh,
more
there's no question.
activity, right? The last couple of years.
Yeah, and people always ask me, they'll say, well, do you think that there's certain areas that it's more prone to? And the answer to that is when we were running, there are a couple of points about that. One, we were running the STAR team. We had somebody plot all the cases on a map, USA map. And after a few months, you'll look at that and you'll find that the concentration of the little dots is all around the populated areas. Like there, for example, going from, I think, Tucson up to Phoenix, is it Interstate 10? There's a bunch of dots on that. But then out over the desert, there's nothing because it's not that it's not happening there. It's just there's nobody there seeing it, if that makes sense. So I don't think it's really that regimented. But one more, let me just say one more thing. When we ran the STAR team, one of the things that we did is we have this dispatch operation, and they were looking at the whole northern hemisphere. For example, the way that MUFON CMS was set up back then is the reports would all go to the state director. So if you're in Pennsylvania, you're seeing all the stuff that happened in Pennsylvania. If you're in Kentucky, you're seeing all the stuff in Kentucky. Well, what we were doing is we were looking at the whole thing. And a lot of times, like you'd see, an orb would start out over here and over Philadelphia somewhere. And then the next thing you know, we track it and go all the way across the country. So we have 30 reports of it, in Pennsylvania, Ohio, Michigan, all the way over to California. So by looking at that whole database, not just breaking it down into states, I think we learned some things from that too.
Wow. I mean, we really appreciate that kind of hands-on research. I'm going to open up to some other people. Kurt's been following, Kurt Johnson's a big part of our team. He's been following this. Diane.
Yep.
Olivia is very interested in this. So does anyone have a question for Richard? Because we can keep talking all day with Richard, but
I have a question about Skinwalker Ranch, because I saw something on the History Channel, and obviously there's a lot of activity there, like people going through portals and time travel. Why do you think that particular location is getting so much activity?
That's a $64,000 question. There apparently are places that are like that. That whatever's going on there is it's related to that geographic area. There's a portal there. They're thinking maybe there might be something underground there, but there's something going on there. And if you read it's the first Skinwalker book that came out that was written by George Knapp and Colum Kelleher. Have you ever read that? Because if you do, it's just like amazing. It talks in detail about all the stuff that was going on there. And, it's so bizarre. Like after I worked on the Bigelow project, I read that book. And if I'd have read it before I knew those guys, I wouldn't have believed it. That's how weird it is. But I know those guys, and I know they're like really above reproach as far as credibility goes on. I believe that everything they said in that book is true, but if I didn't know them, it would be hard to believe. It's so weird.
Some anomalies on land that seems to attract more UFO sightings. Barbara, what did you want to say?
Well,
oh, no, go ahead, finish, Richard, and I'll ask my question.
Well, what I was going to say is like in my book, I've tried to, we've got abduction. And when you define abduction, basically someone is taken and there's usually a craft involved somewhere where they're examined and that kind of thing. But there's also these like the geographic areas where they have portals. I'm a fan of Dave Paulides. I don't know him, but I've read a lot of his stuff and watched some of his videos. And, you know, it's just unbelievable how these people just disappear in the national parks and stuff like that. And that kind of thing seems to be related to some kind of portal because it seems to recur in the same areas. You know, people park in this place and they disappear down here. So it's both. I think some of it is related to vehicles, but I think there's some geographic, there's portholes that are somehow connected to that property or whatever, if that makes sense.
Thank you. Thank you.
Right, so-
I would say
Thank you.
the original agreement that Eisenhower had with the Cosmic Others would suggest that there were certain areas that they could land and use. So there would be portals already recognized in the 1950s.
That might be true. Okay, Barbara, yes, go ahead.
Yeah. Hi, Richard.
Good.
I know a fair amount of the information, classified information, was released to the public a while ago. But there's still a lot that has not. And I just read maybe a month or so ago how this Republican senator is really pushing for the declassification of all of it. Do you have any suspicions or inklings about specifically what might be held back at this point?
As much as possible. I
Yeah.
mean, they're not giving up anything unless they have to. If you look back a couple of months ago, there was some congressman that did open hearings on television, and they interviewed people from the Pentagon. I don't know if you're familiar with that or not, but they actually had some open hearings, and they had some people from Congress, and they were asking them questions about what's going on with this stuff. And most everybody that saw those interviews thought that the guys from Pentagon were just spinning them around. They were just handing them a bunch of crap and wouldn't really tell them what they wanted to know. And I've gotten some feedbacks. They're saying that most of those congressmen are getting pissed because they know they're being stonewalled and they don't like it. And I think that could have been something to do with the fact that this, you know, the NDAA, the language in the NDAA, I think in part that was because that some of these congressmen are pissed and they're going to start pushing back. They want to know what's going on, and they're going to, you know, change the laws or whatever they have to do to make it work. But yeah, there, as far as what's classified, I mean, basically, if you've ever written any of Richard Dolan's books, he wrote a book called AD, and part of that was where they talk about this culture that's developed, and essentially what's going on is back in the Eisenhower administration. There's a book that was written by Philip Corso and
After Roswell.
The day after Roswell. Yeah.
Yes. And in that book, he basically talks about how they went to these private industries and gave them crash wreckage to do back-end engineering on it, and they made deals with them, and said a lot of those deals had to do with them keeping the patent rights on what they made. And you know, there's 2 points to that. One, if you don't believe anything in his book, just look at the companies that he said they gave that stuff to, and then look how they went from ho-hum little technology companies to multi-trillion-dollar global corporate monsters, you know, almost overnight. And that's why I think Eisenhower, when he got Eisenhower got to where, when he was leaving office, he made a speech about beware the military industrial complex because what he called misplaced power, because essentially what they did is they went renegade on them. And once they got their hands on this stuff, you know, they cut the president and Congress out of it and they start doing their own thing. So the answer to your question is yes, I think there's like unbelievable high technology that's been developed. And there's a lot of companies that are making like trillions of dollars on it. I think there's medical technology that's not being used. I think there's energy technology that's not being used. And I really think that there's some merit to, you know, these people talk about, you know, the new Space Force. And there's probably some merit to some of these guys are saying we already have some kind of Space Force, they're just not telling the public about, you know, that NASA's basically the money laundering operation for the real space program. And I'm not so sure there might be some truth to that. But yeah. Go ahead.
No, go ahead. Finish what you were saying there, Richard.
That's it. That's it. I mean, just to answer that question, like there's unbelievable amount of stuff that's out there. Some of that stuff is being used in to develop military technology and super bombers and satellite weapons and all kinds of crap that's being done.
I think as Congress aware of this, they'll realize how illegal it was to do all those things that they've been doing. So it might come out. Kurt Johnson has a question. Kurt.
Yeah, so thanks
Sure.
so much. So,
Yeah.
you know, those of you that know me know that I've really come out of major mainstream science and actually retired from the same institution where Neil deGrasse Tyson is. And of course, he's a big denier. But here's the thing I wanted to ask about, because what we've seen in the mainstream scientific community is once the Pentagon and the Navy released data that was undeniable by any open-minded scientist as a data set that could not be ignored. And those were followed up then by interviews with the pilots, interviews with the radar operators. Suddenly, many people who had been in the ostrich song, as we used to call it, in the scientific community, because they were claiming there was no data here, where all of us know there's been tons of data for years. It was just easy to marginalize it. Suddenly that data became not easy to marginalize, if at all unmarginalizable. And there was a huge shift now within mainstream science.
And it's big money too.
Yeah, oh, absolutely. And so then what's interesting now in following the latest, report from the US intelligence, and then how that was followed on major media, the other data set that starts to convince the mainstream is when they end up pointing to that what's convincing is the number of these craft that have capabilities that aren't anywhere close to anything that we would know on this planet. Right. That gets the attention of the mainstream, both militarily and scientifically, that this is data, and suddenly now this has to be seen. So I was just going to ask you about how you've seen that migration from a lot of marginalization to now much less marginalization because of the mainstreaming of a lot of this.
Well, clearly that, in the time that I was running that project with MUFON, the true value of that is the database. God strike me dead for saying this, but a lot of the stuff that the investigators are doing in the state chapters and all that, it's all fluff. The important thing there is to keep that database going, where people are going on there and reporting their sighting reports and reporting their abductions and all that kind of stuff. So the data is clearly the gem in all this. And you're seeing now that there's some of these other organizations, they're all starting to jump on it, and they're building these databases. And that's, that's really what the value is the database. And not only the database, but also, training investigators to accurately report things in the database. And that's one of the things when I did my book, I'm talking about, there's chapters in there about higher levels of consciousness, and a lot about multidimensional existences. Because if you really want to get into this and figure out what's going on, you got to go down those rabbit holes. And a lot of people don't want to do that, or they can't do it because, their perception of reality is so narrow and limited. And the example, when I say database, what I'm talking about is, let's just take a case, hypothetical. The car is parked here in the parking lot, and they see this light, and it comes down, and it comes right down through the floor. It comes right through the treetops. And then it goes right through a big chain link fence and lands right next to the car. Okay, that's what happened. So now the investigator goes out and interviews this guy, and he's thinking about it and everything. So when he writes the report, he writes, well, this object came over, it flew over the trees, and it flew over the fence, and it landed by the car. Because in his perception of reality, he knows it's impossible what this guy said. So he adjusted his report so it made sense to him. And that's like what a lot of this database is horribly infected with, that kind of faulty thinking. So when you have a guy that's a witness that's telling you that this thing came through a tree, or came through a fence, or it came up out of the water, or it went into the side of a mountain, it needs to be reported exactly what they say. So you have a database that's usable. if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And the other reason I'm really glad to get this feedback, on March 10th, I've been invited to give a seminar, very high-end seminar, basically to scientists who are from the reductionist crowd. And one of the challenges that I'm going to put to them is not only with regard to the UFO UAPs, but transdimensional phenomena, shamanism, healing, where there are data sets out there that are just not deniable at any level of empirical science anymore, that they have to wake up to and start to rearrange how they look at reality with regard to that. You know, many of you know, we just published this book by 32 neuroscientists that's really on clairvoyance, clairaudience, everything that they've run into, and they feel that they can be honest about. And many of these people are at major institutions opening up the door on things which simply, as you just said, Richard, that crowd just has not believed is real. But we're getting to a point now where these things are undeniably real. And then the question is, how do you put the attention, to what extent it could, of empirical and naturalist science, you know, to really looking at them as real phenomenon. So anyway, great.
In my book, I talked about, you know, there's a section in there, it's called Perception of Reality. And what we're doing here is, when you look at multi-dimensional type instances, if you just simply take a look at the quantum physics, you know, there's this project out in Switzerland. It's a particle accelerator that goes underground, and it goes through Switzerland and France. And a few years ago, there was a 60 Minutes did a special on it, and they're talking about all the stuff they're doing there and how it works and everything. And I'm sitting there thinking, you know what? Those guys are looking at other dimensional realities with that thing, you know. And after about a half hour, I said something to that effect, and my girlfriend goes, "You've had too much wine." And then at the end of the show, the guy that's running the thing goes, "Yeah, we've actually been able to identify 12 dimensional realities outside this time-space reality with our research here." And I'm like, yes, you know. So the quantum physicists now, they're saying there's other dimensions outside this. And so, you know, when you look at some of these UFO reports, and people, you know, like airline pilots are saying, we saw this thing and all of a sudden it vanishes, and then pretty soon it up close and it reappears again. Well, what's happening is that thing is going in and out of our three-dimensional reality, and it has to do with in a lot of times people define it like as think about it like this: everything has a certain frequency that it resonates at. So right now we're all resonating at the same frequency, otherwise we wouldn't be able to see each other and talk to each other. Okay. So if you change your dimension, all you're doing is changing your frequency. It's kind of like if you're watching a TV show and you turn it to one channel and you're on a frequency, I can see the show, and I click it over, I change the frequency. Now I'm looking at a different show. Okay. Both those shows exist simultaneously, but whatever frequency you're using is the one that you can see. And that's kind of like how this dimensional stuff works. You're shaking your head. You know where I'm going, right? So yeah. So that's what happens. So, you know, these things, people say, I was talking to Les Velez the other day, and he says, people ask him, well, where do they come from? And some people say they come from other places in the solar system. Some people say they come from other time constraints, and some people say they come from other dimensions. And we both laughed and said the answer is all of the above, because that's basically what's going on. And you know, if you look at ETs that are out there, there's, I believe, you know, back when the French did that Cometa report, and they said there was they were a dozen different species that have visited here, and they all basically have different agendas. And and by the way, they made a comment about Corso's book saying that they believe that's really what's going on in the United States, which what it is. So you've got different agendas, you've got different entities, they've got different agendas, they come from different places, which it kind of makes sense when you look at that. You know, as an investigator, I could show you a dozen different types of vehicle styles and what they look like, you know, saucers and triangles and big ones, you know, all kinds of, you know, tubular shape, which would kind of account for the fact they're probably different species and different technologies. So it's all there, you know. And I think that I personally think that the cat's coming out of the bag, like what you said with the Washington Post, and then those guys, the Tic Tac videos have been put out on public display, and the Pentagon's going, they're real. They're not saying that's, they're saying, yeah, they're real. And then there was some photographs that have been put out by Navy pilots, and they're, yeah, those are real too. So they're admitting that it's out there, the technology's there, and it's like almost impossible to put that back in the can, once you open that can of worms up. So the people are, people are going to start waking up, and it's like, I've been doing this most of my life, and I can remember times when people would just be so ignorant, and just make a fool out of you when you talk about, when you talk about this stuff. And in the book, I wrote about, I worked in the financial world, which gave me the money to do all this research. I had a very good job, and I had a lot of vacation time. But I was speaking at the Rotary down in Charlotte, North Carolina, in a lunch meeting. And there's probably 300 people in there, big Rotary. And they asked me to speak about the UFO stuff. So I put together a presentation that was real generic, nothing kinky in it. And just like, this is how many people report this stuff. And, here's a survey saying all that kind of thing. So I'm about halfway through this presentation, and this guy gets up and starts interrupted my presentation and starts up about how somebody took these two monkeys and spray painted them green and turned them loose somewhere. And of course, everybody started to laugh, and that's what they do to try to throw your presentation off the. So after I finished my presentation, a guy walks up to me who I knew, and he's retired colonel from the Air Force, and he's a fighter jet pilot. And he says, "Hey, Richard, would you meet with me and my son this next week or so and have coffee with him? I think we have something important to talk to you about." I'm like, "Sure." So I go have coffee with these two. His son is an airline captain for U.S. Airways, and he starts telling me about 6 months ago he had this encounter with something at 30,000 feet that was twice as big as his airplane, like right up close on him. It looked like a huge big black ball, and it took him 20 minutes to get around it. And him and his flight crew saw it. So that's kind of like been my experiences where, people will be making fun of you, and then somebody will go, "Hey, come here, I got to talk to you. Let me tell you what happened when I was in the military." But now it's getting a lot easier because people aren't, people are waking up, and it's like, the woo-woo factor is gone now. So I think people are starting to take it seriously, and the research that you're doing, I don't think you could pick a better time to be doing the kind of stuff what we're doing here today than now, because there's a lot of people that are starting to, they're not going to turn your channel off when they see this.
JJ
I was
has
going to say real quick, that Jude Curavan likely would have been on the call. We had a conflict in the UN group that we're a part of. But, with the work that she's done, and then with the 3 most recent Nobel Prizes in physics, starting now, everyone starts to realize the implications of the event horizon. Everything that you're talking about with things appearing, disappearing, going dimension to dimension, is all about event horizons relative to different levels of reality. So, once people start in science to realize the implications of that, they start thinking that backwards now. So the holographic understanding of the universe, non-locality, quantum entanglement, these then start to have real implications in understanding, UAPs, UFOs, healing, the things that go on in shamanism.
And the things that, like, what's being kept from the public, one of the things I did do is I ran across this transcript that back when the Apollo 11 astronauts were on the moon, there was about 725 ham operated radios that were listening to it. Back then, it wasn't encrypted like it is now. And if you're a ham operator, those guys that have those big antennas in their backyard, they could actually hear Apollo talking to Houston. And there's a transcript that's been published by like more than 500 or 600 of them of what happened when Armstrong and Aldrin were on the moon. And I remember as a kid watching that. And I do remember there was a time, and because I was over at my buddy's house and we were all excited watching it, and all of a sudden the screen goes blank. And they're like, "Stand by, there's a problem with the camera." And then about maybe 5 or 10 minutes later, the pictures came back on. Well, what happened when that screen went blank was that Aldrin, Armstrong reaches over and gets Aldrin's shoulder, and the camera goes out. But what he said was, "What the hell was that?" And he's going, "All I want to know is what the hell was that?" And Houston's going, say again. And He goes, a huge saucer just flew right over us and it landed on the crater up there and it's sitting there watching us. And this is like super well documented that this really happened. And basically for 5 minutes, they're talking to Houston and there were two saucers that went right over them. And they were parked up there on the moon watching them when they were walking around. He goes, my hands are shaking so bad I can't operate the camera, and afterwards, a bunch of people at NASA, including like the director of public relations, when they retired, they all said, yeah, that's true. Chris Kraft was the guy at running Houston Control. When he retired, he said that's absolutely true. That's what happened. So I mean, it's been kept from stuff like that's been kept from the public for 50 years. Go ahead. Sorry,
Richard. If I can inject, I worked briefly with astronaut Gordon Cooper, and I was shown a picture of 3 vehicles that were over the astronauts there when they were on the moon.
Yes. Yeah, and there's also stuff on the back of the moon that they've taken pictures of too.
Richard, what we need, and this is what Kurt Johnson just said, we need a future science that looks at the fact that we're multidimensional human beings capable of local and non-local communication.
Yes.
And we're now beginning to roll up, as it were, the screen that has kept us only in the 3-dimensional side of the theater. We're beginning to realize that we are multidimensional citizens.
Yes. Let me get Olivia into the conversation. Thanks for waiting, Olivia. Unmute. And then just unmute. And Olivia's been studying this field for a long time also. So unmute, Olivia. Olivia, you're not unmuted yet. Unmute.
There you go.
Unmute. Oh, wait. No, you're still muted. Just go to the left, lower left-hand side.
Well, we couldn't agree with you more. This has been a great talk as we also talk about the multi-dimensions of beings go through walls, or pick you up and take you through walls. This is all having to do with these multi-dimensional realities. Yeah, Olivia.
It's the lower left. It's where the line is through the mute button.
Yeah, she had some trouble, I think, the other day with her sound. So
She knows that
right.
it is.
And I'll read it. But Richard, I want to ask you, I mean, if other people have some questions, but where is this going? Do you see a future where they'll say, okay, the jig is up, we've known about it, here it is, or does that implicate too many people? The future is leading that way. The future is leading to full-on disclosure, but it's our side that is fighting for the truth. The other side is, no. And how long can they've kept it up for 75 years. Can they keep this up for another 50 years? Or is that I think the UFOs are appearing more and more and they say, either you tell them or we'll tell them. I think it's going to come maybe this year. Linda Moulton House says 2023 might be the year where the Webb telescope finds life on TRAPPIST-8 and the Mars stuff. So something seems to be building. I think it's coming soon. What do you think, Richard?
I think it is too. And in my book, I looked at what I call 5 or 6 things that are going to make it hard for disclosure to happen. And the first one we've already talked about, like at the Greenbrier, where they had this place that was, standby ready for 30 years. And then when they blew their cover, there was all these problems with taxes and things, that laws that were broken, that they got away with because they were operating under black budget type status. Okay. So that's one of the problems. Then some people think that they may do some kind of the defense contractors may try to pull this into the danger area so that they can get more money allocated to them to protect us from the ETs.
By that.
And a lot of people think that, and I'm not so sure there wouldn't be some of that might be, because if they try to make people think that, that there's a danger there, then they're going to get all kinds of money to do all kinds of space weapons and things like that. The other thing is that the strangeness factor makes this really hard to deal with. When you're talking about things that can disappear and reappear, like we just talked about, the average person doesn't compute. I mean, they really don't understand that. And it's because they've been brainwashed since they're a little kid to a certain level of perception. I wrote in my books that, people that we're basically spiritual entities, but we're in these physical bodies. And a lot of what we believe and fear and what we perceive as real is based on how we were raised as kids, you know. And one of the things that I thought was fascinating is some of you probably know about the Monroe Institute. And, you know, if you go in there, there's a living room in there, and they've got this big trophy case with all these spoons and forks that are all bent up and stuff. And when I was involved with Homeland Security, these people that would come out of the Monroe Institute in the Charlottesville airport, they come walking through there, and the screeners would find these, they'd find these spoons and forks that are all twisted up. And like, if I was there, I would go over and start talking to them, and then they get all upset, like, you know, how's the feds know I've been at the Monroe Institute? And I'm like, because I've been there and I know what the spoon's all about. And then you talk to them. But the thing is that I had a couple of friends, a couple like my age, that went there, and they were taking a class on how to do that. And the problem is, someone my age, that's extremely difficult to do, because you've got 50 or 60 years of teaching you this is impossible. But they said that they were doing this class. They bring this kid in, he's about 3.5, 4 years old. He could do it in 4 or 5 minutes. And the answer is because he hasn't learned that this is impossible yet, you know? So a lot of how we deal with everything and how we believe, we're basically spiritual entities that incarnate into these physical bodies. And, you know, you're a lot more powerful than you probably know you are. And that's part of, I think, you know, I think part of that's where the government's coming in, and they don't want people to realize how, you know, like, you can bend a spoon with your head and, you know, with your mind and stuff like that. They want to keep you in your box. You know, they want you to go to work and pay your taxes and mind your own business and keep your mouth shut. And that's what government's all about, you know? So these guys in high places, they know that you start letting people really get into this, it's not going to be good for them, particularly because they're not going to get away with it, you know? And so there's this big, you know, the strangeness part is a fear factor. I wrote about Orson Welles back in the 30s did this, you know, they did this radio show, and I researched it. And it's really kind of interesting how it went down. But basically, they started out and they're just doing their normal radio show. And they go, we interrupt this broadcast that apparently there's a spaceship that landed from Mars, and, you know, and then they come back and go, the military's can't, you know, is helpless against them. And another one landed in New York, and it after about an hour or so, they had this going, and the police are like freaking out because people are like going up the wrong side of the highway trying to get out of town. There's all this mayhem, traffic jams everywhere. People are freaking out. And the police actually went into the studio there to try to get them to turn the program off, because they were just overrun with calls and all this crazy activity, because these people are like panicking to get out of New York. But,
Well,
you know, so I think if you did that on 60 Minutes and said, okay, well, you know, basically the truth is these things are driven by extraterrestrial entities. They come from other planets, you know, and, you know, get into all the mechanics of how they can read your mind, and they can snatch you out of a national forest, and they can abduct you in your bedroom and all this kind of stuff. You know, these people, you know, you're going to have to feed that to them a little bit at a time to get them up to speed with it, you know? And I think some of those, you know, some of the stuff like with Spielberg doing, you know, E.T. and stuff like that, I think those are, some people think that that's part of what they're trying to do, is get with Star Trek and get people used to the concept so that they don't, you know, go freak out when they learn more about, you know, like what was going on in Star Trek. Probably the galactic groups and stuff are probably more real than we realize, you know.
Well,
Go ahead.
Interject.
Please.
I was just thinking for Olivia, so we can hear what she has to say. I'm wondering if Olivia, does anyone have a suggestion for that? I was thinking, Olivia, if you don't care, because
She put it in the chat. She said, Richard and all, in the near future, don't you look for more large-scale mass sightings like Phoenix, which can't be denied, but some will anyway.
sorry.
Well,
Yes.
Yeah,
But-
and
no,
Olivia
that's fine.
has been in the Phoenix area as one of her many places, so she knows what's going on. Yeah, I have to say, yeah, let's answer that question first, and then we'll go and
About
close.
what the question being, is there expect more mass sightings? That's
Large-scale
Well-
mass sightings like Phoenix. which can't be
Well,
denied.
that'd be nice, wouldn't it? I mean, that'd be great. You know, the way the media is now, though, you know, if somebody landed on the White House lawn, I'm wondering if they'd even cover it. You know, it's not what happens, is what the media tells you is going on. Is what people believe. So you got to go through all that. But if it happened in a big city, you know, they'd be kind of undeniable.
But I think there's some other agendas going on, and it's positive because we're out here in Silicon Valley, and you have people like Gary Nolan at Stanford, a biologist, who, when he was younger, actually did see a UFO passing over. And we've talked to, and again, we won't mention their names, others, researchers in Silicon Valley that have had sightings when they were 7 or 14 or whatever, seeing UFOs, and now they're in the field of technology. And many of them feel that their insights have come from that contact, that relationship. And we think that contact, again, if you even see them, and it's in Alan's book, Making Contact, you're always connected and they can feed you information as needed. So I think it's another agenda where the younger people coming in, as you were mentioning, are able to now bring forth some of that information from their own inner psyche, so to speak.
JJ?
So
And it looks like Olivia's unmuted now. I could see. Can you say something, Olivia?
Well, it's just
Yeah,
that,
okay.
you know, so much more of the public believes that something is going on. They know it. So the time is somewhat ripe. I think that, you know, the public has to be prepared so there's not a panic, but this idea of more and more mass sightings like Phoenix, where everyone saw it, all these reputable people, including you know, the governor and people like that, and then they made fun of it and tried to deny it, but the truth was out. And more of those kind of things will start people to question about what their basic understandings are about reality and what can be, and expand their consciousness into more and more scientific research as well.
When did that
Well, and
happen?
Good.
in time, great breakthroughs are coming from all directions, and we're realizing that we live in a awesome universe filled with intelligent life. The universe is favorably disposed to biological diversity, and we're beginning to really write a whole new charter of a new scientific imperative that we're not alone in the universe. Not only are we not alone, but we are spiritual consciousness beings involving a three-dimensional life that will change, I believe, into a fifth-dimensional life as this goes forward. So we're, in a happy sense, discovering that we are part of a divine family.
Yeah, Richard.
One of the things I think what Olivia touched on, what we've been talking about all along, is that all this stuff has come out. You know, they're having hearings in Congress. They've released videos, the Pentagon saying it's real and stuff like that. I think if you had another Phoenix Lights scenario like they had then, that it would be pretty hard to lie their way out of it. You know, I mean, it would be like, you know, if that happened, you've got a couple of dozen congressmen be like, whoa, wait a minute, you know, we're not buying that the weather balloon story, you know.
The in 1997, Eve, but I mean, I know we've been here like an hour and a half, Richard. We really appreciate your time.
I'm fine, time. You're fine, time. I'm fine.
Just a little long. I might have to go a little bit, but I just want to say what we're up against is not the phenomena. It's our thinking, as Kurt always likes to point out. The guy who discovered continental plate tectonics was laughed at and ridiculed until someone figured out, well, this is true. So what we're up against is formulating a new scientific mind, a new way to understand our reality, a new way. We are functioning on Newtonian science, which is 400 years old. You get energy back. Obviously, there's no propulsion system in these craft this way. So we have to start to think within a new scientific paradigm that is people like Neil deGrasse Tyson are refusing to acknowledge. Those pilots on the Nimitz, that was a radar artifact when they saw this craft with their own eyes. So people will only see the level of consciousness they're at. So what we're doing here, consciousness and contact, and the evolutionary leaders and all the people out there, is trying to say we have to think differently about reality. We have to think differently about who we are as human beings. We have to start making contact with this vast, non-local, multidimensional mind that we're all capable of perceiving. When I teach remote viewing, it's like, wow, everyone can do that. So we have to readjust who we are. And Richard, what you've said today, I think is very important, to just show us the actual facts and the story and the histories and the case histories that you've studied, that this is real, and we have to just change our view of what real is. That's where we're stuck, and that's where we have to move forward, and we're at the threshold of a new time. But anything you want to add?
Could I respond to a little, interject here? Do you have a second?
Sure.
Alan, I'm not sure that we can only see what we're capable of seeing or ready to see anymore. I used to feel that way, but now I feel that the intelligences that are making themselves known to us could be scanning and choosing the appropriate people on the basis of maybe their work or their milieu, or maybe their near readiness or whatever. Because plenty of people, as we know, see things and go, what the hell was that? And they like it, the astronaut story. I mean, not everybody is ready to see. So, but many are shown. That's what I'm trying to say.
I think that what you said is really valid, and part of that has to do with the limitations we're putting on ourselves. One of the things I've tried to do is open my consciousness to other things, and the more you make yourself receptive to that kind of thing, the more it comes to you. I mean, it's pretty much like that. I mean, I've written about stuff, and I probably shouldn't say this, but I know things that I don't know how I know them. So for that's worth. But what the when we were doing the Discovery Channel shows, and I was the producer, we'd go to these different things, and they put you in what they call a black drop, which you got a black curtain, and you're in a room, and all you can see is your talking head. And he kept saying to me, well, what do you believe? And I would never tell him, because I'm an investigator. It doesn't matter what I believe. It just matters what the facts that I put in my reports, So what I believe does not taint what I produce in terms of data. And he just kept it up. And one day we're out in California, and he just wouldn't get off it. And so finally he goes, so I got pissed, and I said, okay, here's the deal. Back in the 5th century, Galileo built a telescope that you could see the moons around Jupiter with it. But when he'd invite the scientific community, they wouldn't even come and look at it. And the Pope ended up excommunicating them and incarcerating them. And he wrote this fabulous diagram of the solar system, which we know for a fact is extremely accurate based on his observations with his telescopes. But 1,500 years ago, he got locked up for it. So, and it's kind of like what you guys were saying, is like science, it evolves, and we're basically, most of our science that we're dealing with is pretty Newtonian. What I learned in physics is probably about 400 years obsolete, for what it's worth.
One of the quantum physics scientists says that science evolves one funeral at a time, and that's where.
Right.
That's great. I would do that.
Really,
that's probably true.
Sure. So maybe you come back, and we do this every month or every other month. And I think there's a lot more that we can gain as a group discussion, and any other research that comes up. I just, one last question. Are abductions happening more and more, or less and less? Because I think they leveled off for a while.
I can answer that. I think it depends on what you're doing. Because for a while I was involved in a lot of other stuff. I used to think, geez, they must not be doing that anymore. But then when I got involved with ERT and I'm involved with Opus, and it's still happening, but it just depends on what, where you're getting your information from. I know that, and again, I'm not speaking for MUFON, but I know that like anytime anybody creates a report that answers questions in a way that would indicate they've been abducted or had, some kind of an experience or close encounter, those reports are all pulled out and sent to the guy that's running the ERT. And then they're disseminated to people that do that. So if you're just a regular investigator, you're not going to be seeing that stuff anymore. So I don't know, but I think based on what I know, I think it's just it's probably as bold as it ever is, and probably even, like when we talked about different species, people say, we're talking about all the stuff they're coming here and everything, but it dawned on me to say it when somebody was talking, and I was like, you might look at the guy sitting next to you in the dining room, because he might be one, and you just don't, because there clearly are some humanoid ones that you can't tell that if you didn't know it, you walk past them on the street and never even think about it.
That's good to know. My next book hopefully will be about the whole abduction scenario, because I think I've had that. But we want to thank you for your time. And JJ wants to have some concluding words here.
Well, this is a great time to fasten our seatbelts, because we live in an amazing universe. We're going from humankind to spacekind. I believe the result will be we will be endowed with the understanding of the consciousness to realize we are cosmic citizens in human form in the schoolhouse called Mother Earth. Now it's time to graduate.
Thank you. And I said, property of creation itself. We've taught that it was just formed by accident on this earth, but no, there's something more to the human being, and it's everywhere. And we're going to be meeting our galactic family, I think, very, very soon, openly in the public. And so thank you, Diane. Thank you, Barbara, Kurt, Eve, Janice, and Olivia, and of course, Richard, and my co-hosts here for joining.
And Ashley, who's this one down here, Contacting Conscious Evolution.
How can
Hey,
they?
thanks. I was really enjoyed talking to you guys. I'm happy to, participate again if you need me. And this was real cool. It was fun.
Oh, it's fascinating. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Richard. Our inner world and our outer world are going to merge.
Yeah.
Yes.
I just presentation on this last night for Unity Earth frequency. We called it the trust train, which is the frequency that you can, the trust train is interdimensional. It's a frequency that you can ride to get to the new earth. And it's like all aboard. The thing is that, it's always leaving and it's always arriving. So you can never be late. You can always get on board. But the situation, I think, and I think you mentioned it earlier, is that we're talking about entering a new paradigm, but there are many people who are still thinking from the old paradigm. Even some of the visionaries that I know, they're thinking from a linear perspective about the new paradigm, but their actions to get there are still from the old paradigm. And I think it's really important that, we all learn to, that we need to let go of our baggage. We need to look at the things that try to pull us back into the old paradigm, and we need to let go of our old assumptions and our old baggage. And the trust frequency stops all along the way for you to let go of your baggage. There is no baggage car there. So
I went to a seminar, and we were walking into the auditorium, and had this big sign, and it said, "Leave your perception of reality at the door." And I thought that's sometimes what you have to do.
Okay.
Well, you also for another conversation, but nobody's really spoken here about indigenous cosmology, which really holds a lot of this consciousness in it. And I think the fusion of, quantum science and indigenous cosmology is a great conversation for some future time, if I may be so bold.
Yeah,
well, just a quick comment on that, and JJ knows about this, but one of the concerns of the Indigenous Peoples Forum, and then also sacred sites, parts of heritage sites in UNESCO, is if this discussion only becomes about technology and the military, so it's us, them, and we have to be sure that we can defeat them and kill them. And suddenly then you've got Indigenous people saying, wait a minute, these are our ancestors.
Yeah.
All of our entire cosmologies are these are actually ourselves. So they're very concerned about this conversation being owned only by the technology people and the military people, because it will be about this.
Let's have that conversation on the next Contact and Consciousness program.
So just a final word from Richard. What's your contact information if people wanted to reach you?
You know what? Hold on a second. I'll give you here. Where is it? There we go.
Just to say it because sometimes the chat
And
isn't
you can
seen.
show your.
Yeah,
book.
there you go. Those are my books in I own Lang Publications, and just go to langpublication.com. You can get links to buy the books.
Look,
And
able to do this again and bring in also some of these ideas that we've also had,
Right.
but we want to keep this to a practical.
And we thank you, Richard, for your great work, your great
thank you.
And
and your higher ethic of taking the high road as opposed to the lower.
yeah, Richard,
Well,
really.
I really
Oh, yeah.
enjoyed it, and I'd be happy to participate again anytime.
Good.
Or it's fun.
One more thing can I just throw in here, and that is, it's a longer story, so I won't go into how I know, because it's sort of that Bill Maher concept. How do you know, how do you know this? I don't know how I know it, I just know that it's true. But I know that we talk about biomimicry, that our mother Gaia, who we know is a living, breathing being, practices cosmomimicry. And she is in the process of, we need to include her in the conversation because she's bringing in our galactic relatives that are beyond their interspecies, beyond grays or whatever, that are part of this conversation. And
Janice, can we
I'll just leave it at that.
get her on the next show, Janice? Next time we do it next month or in 2 months. Can we do that? We'll talk about it.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Richard.
Thank you, everyone.
Yes.
Good to see everybody.
Good to see you all.
Yeah, very nice.
So,
Ciao.
thank you.
Bye. See you all again.
Fabulous.
Let me get